AISS, Dr. Ashwini Kumar to say a few words about this.
थोड़ा वक्त लगता है मुझे अपने आप को भी संभालने में। अभी कुछ बॉलीवुड के मेरे मित्र हैं कुमार सर, उन्होंने कहा कि शायर तो बहुत है शहर में, लेकिन ये जुल्फिकार शायर बहुत कम है। ये जुल्फों वाला शायर शहर में कम होता जा रहा है। तो लगता है मुझे अपने आप को संभालनी है। सुमैया मेरा घर है, इट्स माय होम, एंड यू कैन सी दैट मैं भी यहाँ सुमैया हॉस्पिटल भी जाऊँगा इसके बाद फिर घूमता फिरता। तो फर्स्ट इसके पहले कि मैं कुछ बात करूँ, और वीरा ने कुछ खास बात की, तो ये ऑलमोस्ट लाइक आफ्टर 2 months or 3 months of my self-imposed जिसमें आपने देखा one who used to travel like mad, all the time, almost like 100-150 days a year, is suddenly restricted home. And this is my first public appearance, I guess. And I was trying to avoid my walking stick. It's not just about my self-image, but मैंने सोचा कि चल के चलूँ तो अच्छा लगेगा ना। तो पहले मैं वीरा के लिए कुछ कहना चाहता हूँ कि मैं यहाँ क्यों आया, और बहुत संभाल के इन्होंने कहा आपको आना है। मैंने कहा मैं चल कर आऊँगा, चल कर आना, क्योंकि 3 महीने से चला नहीं। इवन वैशाली द बेस्ट इज हियर, एंड I never told Sanjeev and Kumar sir also that I fractured my foot. तो ये चल के क्यों आया, इसके लिए वीरा आपको। इब्राहिम अर्श साहब मेरे बहुत ही पसंदीदा शायर हैं, उनकी एक नज्म से शुरू करूँगा, और मेरा आपके लिए है। गुलशन में लेके चल, गुलशन में लेके चल, किसी सहरा में लेके चल, ऐ दिल मगर सुकून की दुनिया में लेके चल। कोई तो होगा, कोई तो होगा, जितने शायर हैं कुमार सर भी हैं, संजीव हैं, वैशाली है। कोई तो होगा जिसको मेरा इंतजार है, कोई तो होगा जिसको मेरा इंतजार है, कहना है दिल के शहर तमन्ना में लेके चल। ये प्यास जो आपने अपने दुख की बताई, ये प्यास बुझ न पाई तो मैं डूब जाऊंगा, साहिल से दूर तो मुझे दरिया में लेके चल। So thank you very much for inviting me, especially Principal Pawar Sahab, and also my guru, mentor, teacher, Kumar sir is here, Sanjeev, is a long-time friend. And especially I also want to convey my regards to poet friends in Hyderabad, especially Veera's good friend Ramesh has been calling me for a while that you have to go, you have to go. I also didn't tell him that, Ramesh, I fractured my foot, but I would get up and go. I would get up and go, because I kept telling me that this is one place when I got this invite. And last year I remember when I went to Hyderabad for this Hyderabad book festival inauguration, and then I spoke and met my friends, especially from Lombardi community and Banjaras, where I have worked extensively in last 20 years. जब हमारे कभी अच्छे दिन थे, so I used to travel in those parts of Rajasthan, Hyderabad. So that kind of, I'm not going to talk about, sociological history, but Ramesh, Veera and others, my young friends, and I'm deeply grateful to them for kind of reclaiming the space, and especially in the linguistic, artistic and literary space that was not available to them. I mean, often as a historian, when they start talking about denotified tribe or criminal tribes, we start only after 1871. I have a very different and radical view on that, because they have been denied a civilization since the days of our great civilizations. If you look at Jataka tales, I was surprised even, from the Buddhist text and Jaina text, that they are also talking about, criminal tribes, Barbar, Dasyu, Malik, given as place. So we need to really deconstruct Kumar's, these Hindu texts, Jaina texts and Buddhist text back, because there also we have a strong reference about, how a certain, sections of our society were relegated to what is called congenital crime. That can't be possible, Back here, I was telling somebody, that maybe they made the mistake in 1871 census. We again have to look at census and see how these things can be done, historical corrections be done. What you have done, Veera, and others have done recently, that you are also making, cultural correction, a civilizational correction. So I look at your book in terms of a civilizational reclaiming of the space that civilization hasn't given you. So thank you very much for giving this a space to think about it, and now more about your poetry, because I generally am never unprepared when I read a book, because maybe I will hand over to you for your review also. So this book where I'm looking more as a poet myself, as a practitioner poet, and without any hierarchical idea of senior poet or like a younger poet, just looking at that poetic landscape and the sociology that I spoke about it and the kind of history I spoke about it, where this kind of poetry is unusual. Even the so-called protest poetry, we have been very familiar. I'm here in Mumbai, which is kind of a landscape where the protest poetry has flourished, including Namdev Dasal. I never met Namdev Dasal in person. Unfortunately, I was away in the US when the Dalit Panther movement happened, which really changed the very aesthetics and the linguistics and the pedagogy of the poetry, and especially Indian poetry. So what I'm going to speak about, more, from the poetic landscape, and I'm looking at your poetry, and I looked at very closely. So that is why you say about, sharing your dukkha, but not the Buddhist kind of dukkha. There is a collective dukkha here, but that not kind of, a spiritual or metaphysical dukkha that you express. So this book is not kind of a metaphysical, philological book of poems. For me, your book is about a living archive, a living cultural archive, a historical archive, breathing the dust, music, and the wounds of Banjara people. I love, this Banjara, because this Banjara has certain kind of a native resonance, historically and culturally. Long, denotified tribe, I spoke about it a little bit, as born criminals. Unheard of it, but if you look at my research in Hindu, where I talked about, in 19th century, the Darwinians, the neo-Darwinians, and Spencerians, giving a very spurious idea of eugenic, So if you look at 19th century census records across Europe and India, you will find that while they were looking at, born, criminals, and different kind of genetic theory, which is completely spurious and historically wrong. So here, Veera's voice is not as a shadow on the edge of the society. He spoke about, Rayasina, where I spent, and Ketkar sir, was there in Raj Sabha. Still his voice is very, very important and significant. But you are not just a shadow on the edge of society, like the Rayasina shadow, but you demand your presence in terms of what I call Hegelian recognition, So you must recognize me, not just as a poet, but a living human being, That's where you speak about humanity. And this is where I call your work a sociology of presence, This sociology of presence is very different from the sociology of presence that we worked on marginalized community and individuals. Secondly, in this poetics of politics, that your people, like Lombardy, and you haven't spoken about your own Gorkhali, your own language. I mean, like I'm a language poet, as you know. My last 25 years of works are mostly about language, on different kind of languages. I play with the language like in a Lacanian sense. So here. Memory and resistance, what I discovered in Veera's work, memory and resistance are the twin devices, linguistic devices of your presence. memory, retrieves mothers, I looked at closely, fathers, and caravans, caravans. Caravan is a very significant presence in his work. Oddly enough, this is a very unusual presence in Indian poetry. All we have seen, and I have also spoken about through my poetry, itinerant, monks, even, Vasapa and others, in Bhakti movement. So you have itinerant poets, Pandarpur. But Veera's, Lambadis, Veera's Gorkhalis, Veera's Banjaras, a very different kind of caravan. It's a caravan. It's not just itinerant monks, It's very different, than the Buddhist experience also. I don't have time today to reflect more deeply on these issues where you challenge the system that condemned you to invisibility and Banjara people. So therefore what you have done, very briefly I would say, you have tried to define the terms of post-colonial poetry itself. Post-colonial poetry, I'm very familiar with post-colonial poetry itself because I do that poetics myself. But I'm learning from your work how to redefine the poetry itself rather than the cultural and linguistic terrain. That's important. So in a way you enter into the poetry, what they used to call the area of darkness, and you are putting light there, illuminating that, the ethics of the poetry. That's very significant. In fact, the very first poem, Bless Us All with the Well-Being, you set the keynote for altering the post-colonial poetics. Bless bipeds with well-being, bless quadrupeds with well-being, do good to ants and insects, do good to birds and kids. And it's a fantastic translation, This Pandit sir has done fantastic, mesmerizing translation. So when I read as if Maja Marathi should nahi aaye, but still I have the feel and the flavor and understanding of the Marathi, Gujarati poetry. But I read your translation more like, regular native language. And this prayer, you begin with a prayer and you end your poetry book with a bread poem, a bread poem. And this prayer is about earth. And this prayer, you speak about radical inclusivity. And sometimes, the bitterness is good. When I spoke to him, met on the ground floor that, look, I'm coming here, and I never shared my dukh, my niji dukh. That's kind of a niji, not the collective. When dukh is collective, we must share. I'm modifying. So this juxtaposition, what I said about poet unique, the ethics of universal care, and alongside the experience of exclusion, is central to Veera's vision. You have to look at the poetic vision of a poet. What he offers us is not poems alone, but also a vision, a radical vision of the poetry itself. It recalls Kabir's syncretic verses or Tukaram's abhangs, but his voice is sharper. I come from the Kabir's area, and although I'm making a very strong claim, and of late I have written about Kabir also in my Banaras long epic poem, but Veera's voice I find, different than us, more sharper and forged in the crucible of harassment, hunger and caste violence. In Caravan 1, you write, life looks like a mirage and married life like a bonfire lit. It's so true. I mean, like, when you come to Ghats of Banaras and you see Shavas, Astyas lit, and you see a different meaning of the life, but that is spiritual and the tantric and Hindu meaning is not available here. We have a very different symbol of nomadic life here. Nomadic life, and this is where I consider this work and others, like Ramesh work, so uniquely important to us at this stage of Indian poetry, because nomad, we haven't seen, I'm familiar with different traditions of poetry, even I work across translation, and Divya has published translations from Red River, almost about 16, 17 languages. I've never touched, Sanjeev's poem, because Sanjeev's translation is almost a lifetime work, but I have published Sanjeev also. So this caravan, a symbol of, nomadic life, embodies both resilience and disposition. And it's not a literal reference to Banjaras wandering. If you look at archival records, Banjaras has been available there, wandering here and there. and put into one place and regular police monitoring. Every day they had to go to police, all young men, just to report and surveillance, for surveillance. But here, your image contrast, to world literature of migration. I work on migration, so I'm bringing some insight from the migration literature, where huges, limestone huges, Kumar sir will speak more on that, evoking what I call dream deferred. And Kumar sir started with Afro-Americans. I lived in the South America and some parts of the America and taught there and also studied. So I understand what you refer to in terms of African-American Negro experiences. So in terms of that, I find that resonance there, and also see a very great American poet, Joe Horacio, tracing displacement through song. So I find that resonance. Still, Veera's Caravan is still in Banjara's memory. The Negroes never traveled in a caravan. They went through the worst excesses and exploitation of slavery. But here, that whole caravan is important. And this caravan he mentions to pilgrimage to Pandharpur, etc. And at the same time, confronting the system. A hallmark of Veera's poetry is relentless attack on the faceless system, often imagined as a cruel concubine. Let's pour the poison sitting in the breast into the tears of the Philippine concubine. Named system is quite a rare image and rare metaphor for a brutal system. You can see the sensuousness here, and this sensuousness is quite rare. And this recalls me, referring to Namdev Dhasal's searing indictments in Golpita or Narayan Surve's depictions of working class precarity. But Veera's intervention differs. His critique is not from the chawl or city slum, but from the caravan. And this is where Indian poetry and the metaphysics of Indian poetry is bound to change. The forest clearing, the settlement compound. He in fact expands, and more, Kumar sir and Sanjeev will speak on that, the whole geography of Marathi poetry is changing and going beyond Namdev Dhasal's bastis into nomadic tribal, areas, tribal spaces. Of late we have captured, and I have wonderful friends, in fact I'm born into a tribal land, so Santals and others can see that. And also women poets from the tribal communities. Several points foreground the systemic, the sexual exploitation of tribal women. The Curse of Being a Whore is one of the remarkable poems of his collections. Similarly, Tiny Bells exposes ritualized prostitution. We have worked as a sociologist on that. And where there's so much, societal resistance and, protest has happened, where the girl's body is commodified as a family's only capital. If you read the history of capital in a Marxian sense, you don't get that sense what Veera brought out. Where the women's body becomes a capital, perhaps. Marx himself was a man. Of late I teach a lot of feminist stuff. And I see that Marx was pretty much oblivious of the women's body as part of the capital, It's very interesting the way Veera defines that body of the girl being sold as capital, as only capital, which is remarkable. These are not simply stories of individuals, but indictments of patriarchy, caste and poverty. Veera often, turns inward. That's kind of a poet, and he suffers between protest, resistance, outside, and then inside, If you are going to be in Indian tradition, Bhavabhuti, Kalidas, etc., and the Vedic tradition, you have to go inside, inward also, and he does it so beautifully. In his poem, The Sand Slips from the Mind. He writes, the liquor drank my father, this common experience, fate killed my mother. Here the personal fuses with political, addiction, poverty, and neglect becomes tragedies, and that are intimate, inside. In Anxieties of My Lost Childhood, he fears his son. I'm sure he will not, but he says that my son will inherit the same ruthlessness I'm sure he will read your book and he will be out of that. In My Mother, My Beloved poem, he calls poetry both mother and sweetheart, a lover also. That's the source of his sensuousness, that's the source of his protest also. And also reclaiming his, history and heroes. The monopolists of history have declared you a decad, but we have inscribed you as the father of India's independence. We have to write our history again and again and again, the so-called nationalist history. Whatever we look at, I guess. And here I find the literary reclamation pronounced very strongly, like Sharan Kumar Limbales, Prakash Balmiki's Jyotan, and also, as I referred earlier, Afro-American reinscriptions, And again, that I'm not going to give you a long lecture on this magical realism and surreal testimony. What I was really intrigued by you, Veera, is, a constant invocation, of magical realism. We have been taught from Latin American literature about magical realism, and I'm very happy that magical realism, because if you look at the entire Marathi landscape, Sanjeev is here and he will speak more about, social realism in Marathi poetry, and you have brought, a very radical magical realism. Very radical magical realism. And this radical realism, I recall Gabriel Marquez Macondo, where ghosts walk among the living, and Octavio Paz's luminous metaphors of time and body, and Pablo Neruda's Saralotes here, when you are looking at peacocks tattooed on the skin of your women. That's magical realism. So beautiful. And as I have been talking about how Veera is trying to change, if that would be a strong term, but trying to really make more luminous, the devotional cadence of Marathi poetry, to Caravan and etc. So when I read him, then I found that, look, his voice is devotional, but not spiritual in that sense, And there is a connection between Bhakti protest and Veera's, this Caravan protest. Finally, in conversation with Global Voices, I work with the global poetry as well. So, of late, I'm reading a lot of stuff from, African immigrant, poets, and especially Washan Sire, the Somalian, which is poet of exile. So Veera crafts a very radical aesthetics of exile at home. That's the poetry, that's the beauty of his poetry. So like Chris Abani of Nigeria, who turns violence into luminous fragments of lyric, I read in English. I can't read a script of Bangla, Marathi and Gujarati, but I can get there. I can understand that lyric. And therefore, what I call in Veera, you read beauty and brutality. Not as a binary, not a postmodernist binary, Finally, his voice echoes. One of my very favorite poets is Adonis. He has influenced my new work, Midnight Here, and Midnight Here has a strong imprint of the great Syrian poet Adonis. So I find Adonis here too, in terms of reclaiming the mother tongue. So I would like him to focus more on his Barakali, more on his mother tongue, and speak through this mother tongue. So bless us all is a prayer, archive, living, and a living revolt, a love song, and also a war cry for Marathi literature and also the Indian English poetry, or rather the Indian poetry. It opens a new frontier, making nomadic voices parts of the beating heart of the expanding geography of Indian poetry. But stop, friends. His caravan does not end here. Like any caravan, it never stops. So he inspires us, a new generation, reclaiming marginal inheritances. Ramesh Jacinta Karketa, a very good friend of mine, Nirmala Putul, Santhal, and together I suspect in a different luminous way, a new constellation remapping India's literary sky. Finally, Fanon, one of my teachers, whom I approached through my Guru Ashish Nandi, Fanon once named Fanon once named the dispossessed, we are all familiar, and Kumar sir, the wretched of the earth. Veera's Caravan insists the wretched of the earth inherit not only the soil beneath bare feet, but the sky above them. Their caravans, their constellations that guide them, the dawn that promises renewal. So in conclusion, in Veera's poetry, Fanon's wretched reclaim earth and horizon alike dispositions becomes a song of boundless freedom. Thank you very much.
Now let me return my